There are restaurants in this country where money alone will not get you through the door. Aubergine 11 sat on the second floor of a converted Victorian building in downtown Ottawa, accessible only by a private elevator that required a key card, one issued exclusively to members and their approved guests. The waiting list for a standard reservation had stretched, as of last autumn, to 8 months. The deposit required to hold a table on a Friday evening was $1,200, non-refundable, and the menu changed entirely every 6 weeks, according to whatever executive chef Dominic Saulnier decided the season demanded. There were no prices listed. If you needed to ask, the maitre d' would smile and suggest, gently, that perhaps you might prefer to try the bistro downstairs. Reyna Marchetti had worked there for 4 years. She moved through the dining room the way water moves around stones, without effort, without noise, without calling attention to the movement itself. She knew which regulars took their sparkling water from a carafe rather than a bottle. She knew that Mr. Aldous, the investment banker who came in on the 3rd Thursday of every month, had a shellfish allergy he always forgot to mention and needed to be steered quietly away from the bisque. She knew that the couple in the corner booth on anniversary nights needed the lights dimmed 2 degrees and the jazz turned up slightly, never the other way around, and she knew this because she paid attention the way most people in that building did not bother to. She was 31 years old, and she had, in another life, been 3 months from finishing a double degree in applied linguistics and international law at the University of Toronto before everything stopped. Her mother's diagnosis came in November of her final year. Stage 3. The treatment was aggressive, the bills more so. And her father's English had never extended much beyond what he needed for the hardware store he ran in Gatineau. Reyna had come home. She had told herself it was temporary. 4 years later, she still told herself that, though she said it less often now, and with considerably less conviction. She had found Aubergine 11 because the pay was exceptional, and the hours could be arranged around hospital appointments. She had stayed because, if she was honest, there was something in the precision of it, the clean linen, the exacting standards, the way a meal here was constructed like an argument, each course building toward a conclusion, that satisfied something in her that nothing else in her current life quite reached. What she did not stay for was the occasional guest who looked at her the way Harlan Voss looked at servers. She noticed him the moment he came through the private elevator, not because he was particularly tall or particularly striking, though he was both, but because of the way he entered a room, with the specific practiced energy of a man who expected the room to reorganize itself around his arrival. He was perhaps 50, with silver at his temples, and the kind of tan that suggested he had spent the winter somewhere the Canadian sun did not reach. He wore a dark navy blazer over a black turtleneck, no tie, the studied casualness of a man who wanted you to know he no longer needed to try. His name, Reyna, would learn from the reservation, was Harlan Voss. The file the maitre d' kept on regular guests described him as founder and principal shareholder of a resource extraction company with operations in 3 provinces, net worth estimated somewhere north of $2 billion. The file also noted, in the careful shorthand the staff used for guests who required particular management, difficult when idle. He had brought 4 people with him, 2 men who appeared to be subordinates. They laughed at the right moments and said very little. And 2 women, one of whom was introduced to no one and spent the evening looking at her phone, and one of whom was Leonora Ashcroft. Reyna recognized the name before she saw the face. Leonora Ashcroft was the kind of person whose name appeared in business sections and on conference panels, the CEO of a mid-sized pharmaceutical firm based in Vancouver, that had, in the last 2 years, become considerably larger than mid-sized. She was in her mid-40s, with close-cropped grey hair and the particular stillness of someone who had long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. She watched Voss the way a scientist watches a specimen, with interest but without attachment. It was, Reyna thought, an unusual dynamic. She filed it away. The evening began unremarkably. Reyna brought the menus, explained the evening's courses with the quiet fluency she had long since perfected, answered questions about the wine program and the sourcing of the lamb. Voss did not look at her when she spoke. He spoke over her once, to the man beside him, about something happening in Calgary, and she waited without expression for him to finish before she completed her sentence. It was a particular skill, waiting without showing that you were waiting, and she had become very good at it. The first real moment came with the second course. Voss had ordered the venison tartare off menu, a modification that required a brief conversation with Chef Saulnier, which Reyna handled and returned in under 4 minutes. When she brought the dish, Voss studied it for a moment, then looked up at her for what was, technically, the first time all evening. "You've worked here long?" "4 years," she said. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are not actually acknowledging what you've said, but preparing to say something else. "And before this?" "School," she said, and left it there. Something flickered in his expression, the briefest recalibration, a slight narrowing of interest, and then he smiled the way men like him often smiled at people like her, pleasantly, conclusively, as though he had asked a question and received the answer he already expected. "Right," he said, and turned back to his table. Leonora Ashcroft, Reyna noticed, was watching this exchange with an expression that was difficult to read. The evening moved through its middle courses with the practiced efficiency that Aubergine 11 demanded, and Reyna delivered without appearing to deliver anything at all. She refilled glasses before they were empty, cleared plates before their absence became awkward, answered questions from the 2 quieter men at the table about the cheese program and the history of the building. She spoke with them the way she spoke with everyone who actually wanted to talk, attentively, specifically, as though their questions were the only questions she was there to answer. Voss watched this. She knew he was watching, in the way she knew most things about her tables, peripherally, without making it apparent. She had seen this particular kind of attention before. It was not appreciation, it was assessment. The moment arrived with the 4th course. Voss had been talking, for the last 20 minutes, with increasing volume and decreasing point, about a recent trip he had taken to the Pyrenees. "Business," he said, though from the shape of the conversation it sounded more like an extended holiday with a meeting attached. He explained to the table, and it became clear to the room, spent considerable time in the Basque country. He had found the landscape extraordinary, the food exceptional, the culture, he said, deeply underrated by people who didn't know where to look. He had also, he mentioned, picked up some of the local language. "Most people don't know it exists," he said. Euskara, completely isolated, no known relatives among any other language on earth. The linguists call it a language isolate. He said this with the confidence of a man who had read half an article about it. Most educated people couldn't tell you a word. Reyna was at the sideboard, adjusting the presentation of the next course, not facing the table. She heard all of this. She had been hearing it for several minutes. She heard what came next. When she turned back to the table with the sea bass, Voss was looking at her with the particular expression of a man preparing to perform. He spoke several sentences in Basque. The Basque he spoke was functional, reasonably accented, and clearly designed to be incomprehensible. He was asking, in the language, whether the fish was fresh or frozen. A deliberate choice of question. She understood immediately, because if she simply set the plate down and smiled, she would look as though she had understood nothing. And if she guessed at what he might have said and got it wrong, she would look foolish. The two subordinates were smiling. The woman on her phone had looked up. Leonora Ashcroft had gone very still. Reyna set the plate in front of Voss with the same care she gave every plate. Then she answered him in Basque. She told him, in the language, that the sea bass had arrived that morning from a supplier in New Brunswick, that it had been prepared with a butter made from cultured cream from a small dairy outside of Montreal, and that if he preferred his fish prepared slightly differently, she could speak with Chef Saulnier directly. Then she stepped back and waited. The silence at the table lasted approximately 4 seconds, which is a very long time in a restaurant dining room. Voss's expression went through several things in those 4 seconds. Surprise, which he could not suppress quickly enough. A rapid attempt to reassemble the composure he had just lost. Something underneath that, something she recognized, because she had seen it before on the faces of men who had been certain of their position and found the ground had shifted, which was closer to genuine discomfort than he would have liked. "Where did you learn that?" he said in English. "My grandmother is from the Basque region," Reyna said, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. She came to Quebec in the 70s. She used to say it was important to keep the language alive in the family. I grew up speaking it with her. She could have stopped there, but she added, with the mild and professional air of someone making conversation, "You have a very good accent, by the way. The vowels are difficult for most people." It was not a weapon, the way she said it. It was a compliment, offered genuinely, and that, somehow, was worse, for him, than anything sharp would have been. Leonora Ashcroft made a sound that might, in a different room, have been a laugh. The rest of the dinner passed with a different quality of silence from Voss's end of the table. He ate well, drank the remainder of the burgundy, spoke less, and did not address Reyna directly again. The two subordinates, picking up on the change in atmospheric pressure the way subordinates always do, became correspondingly more quiet themselves. The woman on her phone ordered a dessert and seemed, if anything, relieved. Leonora Ashcroft ordered her dessert, then looked at Reyna directly for the first time all evening. "The sea bass was exceptional," she said. "Please pass that along to the kitchen." "Of course," Reyna said. "I'd also like to leave a card." Leonora opened a slim card holder that she produced from inside her jacket and set a card on the edge of the table, not extending it toward Reyna exactly, but positioned so that Reyna could take it without making a thing of the gesture. "When you have a moment." Reyna pocketed it without looking at it. She looked at it in the break room after the table cleared, sitting on the bench by the coat hooks with her shoes off and a glass of water on the shelf above her. The card was heavy, cream-colored stock, the kind that cost more per box than Reyna made in a shift. On the back, Leonora had written a phone number in handwriting that was spare and exact, and 3 words beneath it. "Call me." Seriously. Reyna read it twice. Then she set it on the shelf next to her water and sat for a moment in the quiet of the break room, listening to the distant sound of the kitchen finishing its close. She had learned, over the last 4 years, to be careful with hope. It was not that she had become cynical. She was not, temperamentally, a cynical person, but she had learned that hope had a weight to it, and that carrying too much of it in the wrong direction cost more than the disappointment alone. So she sat with the card for what it was, a small, specific thing. A number, 3 words, an open door, maybe or maybe not. She thought about her mother, who was 3 weeks out from her most recent scan, which had been, cautiously and in the qualified language of oncologists, good news. She thought about the application to Osgood Hall she had downloaded and not submitted. 3 times. She thought about her grandmother, Amaya, who had died the winter before, who had taught her Basque in the kitchen on Sunday mornings while the radio played, who had told her, in Basque, which gave the sentence a weight it did not quite have in translation, that a woman who knows many languages is never truly at the mercy of any room she enters. She picked up the card again. She called on a Wednesday, during the window between lunch and dinner prep, sitting in her car in the parking structure 2 blocks from Aubergine 11, with the heat running because the April air still had not fully committed to spring. She had rehearsed what she would say for approximately 3 days, and then, when the call connected on the second ring and Leonora Ashcroft's voice came through the phone, brisk, alert, not unkind, she said none of it. "I wasn't sure you'd call," Leonora said. "I wasn't sure I would either," Reyna said, which was true. "I'll be brief because I expect you're between shifts. Ashcroft Pharma has a new division opening, regulatory affairs and international compliance. We've been looking for someone with a specific kind of capacity, not just language, though that matters, but the ability to read a room, to understand what's actually being said underneath what's being said." A pause. "I watched you manage that table for 3 hours on Friday. I watched you handle a man who was being deliberately rude and come out of it with more dignity than he had walking in. That's not a thing you can train." Reyna was quiet for a moment. "I don't have my degree," she said. "I'm 3 credits short of finishing. I had to leave for family reasons." "I know," Leonora said. "I did some reading. Reyna Marchetti, University of Toronto, enrolled in the combined LLB and linguistics program, left in her final year. It wasn't difficult to find. Another pause, shorter this time. 3 credits. That's a conversation for another day. What I'm offering you now is a position on the compliance team with a salary range I'll send you by email because numbers over the phone feel strange to me, and I'd rather you have time to look at them properly." What would the role actually involve? You'd be reviewing regulatory submissions across our international partnerships. We work with companies in France, the Netherlands, South Korea, and we're currently negotiating with a firm based in San Sebastian, which is, as it happens, in the Basque country. You'd be in rooms where things get said in languages the other people present don't understand. You'd be expected to understand. Leonora paused again. "Are you someone who understands?" "Yes," Reyna said. "Good. Look at the numbers. If they don't work, tell me why, and we'll talk. If they do work, come and meet the team." The call lasted 11 minutes in total. Reyna sat in her car for another 20 minutes after it ended, which she could afford to do because she had timed it right, and the parking structure was warmer than the street. She did not feel what she thought she would feel, which she had imagined would be something large and dramatic, relief, or elation, or the particular overwhelm of something long deferred finally arriving. What she felt instead was quieter, something in the register of recognition, as though a thing that had always been true about her had simply been seen by someone with the authority to act on it. She drove home the long way, past the hardware store her father had run for 22 years, which still had his handwriting on the sign above the door, a small stylistic flourish on the letter R that her mother had always said was too elaborate for a hardware store, but that her father had refused to correct because he liked it, and it was his name on the door. The lights inside were still on. He would be doing inventory. He always did inventory on Wednesdays. She did not stop. She drove home. The email arrived at 6:47 that evening. The number in it was higher than she had allowed herself to expect, because she had learned to keep her expectations at a level she could sustain, and this was higher than that level. She read it 3 times. The third time, she read it out loud to herself, quietly in the kitchen, because she wanted to hear the number in the air rather than just on a screen. Her mother called while she was still standing at the kitchen counter. "You sound different," her mother said, after 30 seconds of ordinary conversation. Her mother was like that, not psychic exactly, but finely tuned to the frequencies of people she loved. "Something happened today," Reyna said. "Tell me." She told her. Not all of it. Not the part about Voss and the Basque, which would take longer to explain, and which she was still processing herself. But the call, and the email, and the number. Her mother was quiet all the way through, in the way she had been quiet during Reyna's childhood, when something important was being said, completely still, fully present, as though silence were a form of attention. When Reyna finished, her mother said, in Italian, which they had always used for serious things between them, "Your grandmother would say you earned this the day you started learning." "I know," Reyna said, "but I'm saying it now." Reyna stood in her kitchen for a moment after the call ended, looking at nothing in particular, the window above the sink, the reflection of the overhead light in the glass, the dark of the yard beyond it. The Burgundy region of France, she thought randomly, was not so far geographically from the Pyrenees. She had learned this once, from a wine training at Aubergine 11, in the context that had nothing to do with what it meant to her now. She had learned a great many things in that dining room. Not all of them were about wine. She thought about what Leonora had said, a woman who can read a room. She thought about the 11 years she had spent learning to be invisible in rooms. Not in the diminished way, but in the skilled way. The way a good listener is invisible. The way the best interpreters at international tables are invisible, present in every word exchanged and registered in none of them. She thought about Voss. Not with anger. She had moved past that in the parking structure, efficiently and without drama, the way she moved past most things, but with something closer to understanding. She recognized what he had been doing, because she had been in rooms her entire adult life where men like him operated on the assumption that intelligence was distributed along lines they had already drawn, and that a woman in an apron was standing on the wrong side of those lines. She did not take it personally. She took it as information. The information she had gathered from this particular evening was, she thought, not without value. 3 weeks later, she handed in her notice at Aubergine 11 on a Tuesday afternoon in Chef Saulnier's office, which smelled of coffee and the particular cedar of the shelving where he kept his cookbooks. He shook her hand and told her she was one of the best front-of-house staff he had ever had, which she believed, because Dominique Saulnier did not say things he didn't mean. The maitre d', Bertrand, a man of enormous discretion and surprisingly warm feeling, who had worked there 14 years, walked her out through the kitchen, where 3 of the cooks clapped, and one of them, a young man from Laval who had been there only 8 months, looked genuinely upset. She would miss it, she thought. Not the difficult tables, not the long Saturdays, not the particular specific soreness of standing in the same square meters of floor for 8 hours, but the precision of it, the clean logic of a meal composed correctly. The way a dining room at its best was a kind of choreography. Everyone moving in their own orbit, and all of it adding up to something that felt, from the outside, entirely effortless. She had been part of that effortlessness for 4 years. It was not nothing. The first time Reyna walked into the Ashcroft Pharma offices in Vancouver, she wore the same expression she had worn into every difficult room for the last decade. Interested, observant, steady, without need of approval from anyone present. The first meeting of the international compliance team included 2 lawyers, an economist, a policy analyst from Ottawa, and a woman from the San Sebastian partnership who spoke French and Basque and moderate English, and who, in the first 20 minutes of the meeting, said 3 things in Basque under her breath to her assistant that she clearly did not expect anyone else at the table to understand. Reyna understood. She waited until an appropriate moment in the conversation, then addressed the woman from San Sebastian directly, in Basque, with a question about a specific clause in the draft regulatory submission, a technical question, precise, substantive, the kind of question that could only come from someone who had read the documents carefully and understood what they were looking at. The woman from San Sebastian looked at Reyna for a moment. Then she smiled, not the polite smile of a business meeting, but the real one, the involuntary kind, and answered at length in Basque, and the meeting shifted in the way that meetings shift when the actual conversation finally begins. Leonora Ashcroft, at the head of the table, did not say anything, but later, as the room was clearing and Reyna was gathering her documents, Leonora paused beside her for a moment. "How was the first day?" she asked. Reyna considered the question. "I think," she said, "this is going to be exactly what I was looking for." Leonora nodded. She had the expression of someone confirming something she had already known for some time. "Good," she said. "Me too."